All right, so King Louis has been executed by guillotine, which is a gigantic contraption. You can see it right here. If I was to see how well I can draw with a mouse. So you have giant posts on either side and a crossbeam, and attached to it is a very heavy blade, typically with an angle like that. And this would then, with a rope connecting to it, would be like a drawstring, and you pull something and it releases the blade, which then falls with a ton of force because it's very heavy. And laying below, you have the person lying down. And the blade comes down and it severs the head. And the head would oftentimes, you would rest in a something that would be over top of you with a curve to fit for your head, kind of like a stocks or a guillotine. And then below, in the front, there would be a basket to collect the person's head once the blade falls down. And then the executioner would pick up the head and hold it up for the crowd. So that's what's happening over here. They're showing the king's head. And here you can see that as well. Someone's holding up the head. So, yeah, the crazies have taken over the French Revolution. This is not at all like the American Revolution anymore. Even though it was maybe inspired at the beginning by it. They went in a very different direction. So the French Revolution becomes very bloody at this point. And even people like Thomas Jefferson, who were eager, excited, flattered that the French were following in America's footsteps, they began to be turned off by how just ruthless, bloody, angry, misdirected. It was just chaos. They were just turning on anyone. So people call this very bloody, crazy time the Reign of Terror. Terror is reigning over the people. The French government, during this Reign of Terror, was renamed themselves the Committee of Public Safety. This was like one of the key bodies of the French government during the Reign of Terror, which is so ironic because this committee, this group of people, were not at all concerned with the public safety. They killed anyone who was even suspected of opposing the French Revolution. And they killed them by drowning people, by shooting them, but most of them were killed by the guillotine. Here's a close-up of the guillotine. And what's really crazy is most of the people that were killed during the French Revolution, during this Reign of Terror, were peasants. People from the Third Estate who were already oppressed historically. The whole purpose of this revolution was to try to gain rights for the peasants. So here's two disturbing statistics about the French Revolution. 13,000 people were executed in just 47 days. That's like a month and a half. 13,000 people were killed by the government, most of them peasants. And of those killed, about 20 to 40,000 people happened just during the Reign of Terror, which was a relatively short-lived period of the French Revolution because it was so crazy. You can't have that kind of chaos reigning. People turning on anyone, just being suspecting someone of being opposed, just suspected, and it's like, oh, they gotta die. And they turned on everybody. Lavoisier, he's known as the father of modern chemistry. He was killed because he was connected to the First and Second Estates. So they killed a brilliant scientist, someone that the French are quite proud of today. But nope, he had to die. Thomas Paine, the man who wrote Common Sense, the short little pamphlet explaining why it's just common sense for the Americans to have independence from the British. Well, when the French Revolution got going, they said, hey, he helped the Americans with their ideas. Let's have Thomas Paine. Even though he's British, let's have Thomas Paine join us. So he was part of that National Constituent Assembly, the Third Estate's government. He was almost guillotined because he said, we shouldn't execute the king. That's not how the American Revolution happened. And we don't want to go down this dark path of just killing people. So he was put in jail. He wrote a letter to to George Washington, begging him, please do something, spare me, speak out. Ask for me to be forgiven or released. And Washington would not. He said, we can't get dragged into this war. We're not strong enough. I'm sorry, you kind of did it to yourself. You shouldn't have joined those crazies, Thomas Paine. So Thomas Paine was understandably upset and felt betrayed by George Washington. But just before he was going to be guillotined, Robespierre, remember the prominent leader of the Reign of Terror, here he is pictured again, Robespierre was executed himself. How did we get to that point? Well, let's keep looking. So Charles Dickens, he wrote a book, a classic really, called A Tale of Two Cities. The two cities are Paris, France, the capital of France, and London, the capital of England. And it covers two men, Darnley and Carton. Both of them fall in love with the same woman, Lucy, and she likes the two men, but she ultimately chooses Darnley. And Darnley, is going to be guillotined, but Carton visits him in his cell. He holds something over it, like a chloroform or something, drugs him, and takes his place. And they look enough alike, and they're killing, look at the statistics. They're killing so many people. It's not as if the French are going to notice that the person is different. They're killing people willy-nilly. And so Carton ends up dying in place of Darnley because of his love for Lucy and his friendship with Darnley. And the closing line of the book, it's a beautiful line. He says, it is a far, far better thing that I do than I have ever done. It is a far, far better rest that I go to than I've ever known. Now he knows he is going to die and go to heaven because he loves Jesus, and he demonstrated that by dying for his friend. No greater love has this than a man lay down his life for another. And the opening line is quite famous too. So the closing line is beautiful and I love it, but the opening line is even better known. And it is, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. And it keeps going, it was this, and it was this, and this. So it's this, and that's true. This is an exciting time of change, that monarchies, absolute monarchies, are going to be done. We're going to finally have the change that we need. So it was the best of times in that sense, but it was also the worst of times because we got a bunch of crazy people killing people at random. Well, one of the friends of Robespierre, who was also a supporter of the French Revolution, was a very famous and talented painter named Jacques-Louis David. And he painted this painting of Lavoisier, the scientist who was beheaded. Here's a close-up of him at the desk. The Oath of the Horatii, Death of Marat. He did a number of famous paintings of Napoleon. Really, I really enjoy his artwork. But he was a friend of Robespierre, and he did a lot of his painting during the Revolution and afterward. Now, the next painting is, and you may recall the name, by the way, Marat is one of the three leaders of the Jacobins. So he had a really bizarre skin condition and had to soak in a bath for a very long time. Now, this next painting is not by him, but it shows a woman who said that she had information on some people who opposed the French Revolution. And so he said, come in, and this actually happened. She came in and she pulled out a knife and stabbed him to death to try to stop the executions of peasants. And so here you see this painting of the French revolutionaries saying, no, how could you do this? She's like, very easily, this guy's a crazy person who's killing peasants, killing the Third Estate that he's claiming to protect. And so the Reign of Terror begins turning on itself. Danton again, one of the three leaders of the Jacobins, turns to Robespierre and says, I don't know that we need this reign of terror anymore. We keep guillotining people. We're running out of true bad guys. We're guillotining, I don't know if that's a word, but we're cutting off people's heads with the guillotine, but we've run out of true enemies, and now we're just going after anyone who claims that someone is opposed to our revolution. And Robespierre says, a traitor! You need to be guillotined yourself. And fear of Robespierre led the rest of the Committee of Public Safety to turn on Robespierre. And so they go for Robespierre, and he is scared. So Robespierre tries killing himself, fearing the guillotine and what the angry mob will do, but he is not successful. It's pretty gory, actually, what happened to him, so I'll spare you the details. But he tried killing himself and survived, and they quickly got a doctor to prevent him from dying, just so that they could prolong his life long enough to cut off his head with the guillotine. Well, while all of that craziness was going on, the Committee of the Committee of Public Safety asked the entire nation of France to really get behind this war effort, and that's kind of known as total war, when you do everything you can to fight this war. So they said, young men, obviously you need to fight. That's your task. That's what you are called upon by your nation. But other people can do things. Married men, okay, we don't want to leave a bunch of widows, so you can make weapons, though. Work in these factories and make weapons to give to the young men to do the actual combat. Women, you can make tents, you can work as nurses in the hospitals, do your part. Children, you can take old clothes, turn it into lint for the war effort, for firing weapons. And old men, use your wisdom. Encourage the young men to fight bravely for France, that there's no greater thing you can do for your country. And so this war is going on at the same time that the government is turning around and killing itself. Marat just, here we go. Marat was just killed by someone who decided that he needed to die. The committee needed to be stopped. Danton gets killed by his friend, Robespierre. Robespierre is then killed by the rest of the committee, who is terrified of what he might do to them. Here's a diagram of his death. And again, they held up his head afterward. And all this chaos can't be sustained. And so one of the leading generals, Napoleon Bonaparte, pictured here, let's zoom in over here, he starts leading the French to victory, and they are led by a brand new weak government called the Directory. This very, very weak government. They have 5 directors, which would be similar to a U.S. president, and they all agreed to share power. It happened in 1795, and they sent Napoleon on different tasks. Eventually, Napoleon overthrows this directory. They give him a suicide mission because they're getting scared of his rising popularity and power. And so he overthrows them in what is known as a coup d'etat. People call it just a coup for short. And that happens all the time. There are coups that have multiple coups a year in the world. So this is something that still occurs today. But a coup, or a government overthrow, a forceful government overthrow, was used by Napoleon to overthrow the Directory, and that is typically considered to be the end of the French Revolution, because Napoleon then sets himself up as Emperor of France and begins taking over all of Europe. And that is the French Revolution.